pronounce your second name, surname. Is it Nešťáková, or how do I pronounce it?
That was very correct.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great, thanks.
And we are live on YouTube.
Okay, great. So good morning, because it is still morning here in Berlin. Welcome to the second session of the second day of the conference, Mother, Father, Child, Health, the History of Reproduction, with a 30 minute delay, but still we'll manage to do everything on time within 1 hour. My name is Maciej Gugała. I'm with the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Berlin, and I'm moderating this session entitled Clerical, Political, and Medical Advice. Our session is scheduled to be 1 hour long. It will last until 12:30 p.m. and it comprises of two papers. The first one to be delivered jointly by Doctors Natalia Jarska and Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, and the second one by Dr. Denisa Nešťáková. So we are now moving to the first paper. Our speakers, Natalia Jarska and Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, are both historians. Natalia Jarska is an assistant professor at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Her research interests include women's and gender history, history of sexuality, and labor history in state socialist Poland. Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska is an assistant professor at the American Studies Center of the University of Warsaw. She specializes in the 20th century social and cultural history of the United States and Poland. The areas of her research include women's and gender history, transnational history of reproduction, and history of social movements. Natalia Jarska and Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska will deliver the paper entitled Love and Calendar, the Catholic Church and Family Planning in Poland, 1930 to 1956-57. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. Just a small remark. Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, not Jankowska.
Sure.
Okay. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for making this event possible, and for all of you, to all of you for being here. Yes, I will present while Sylwia will be sharing her screen and running the presentation. I will start by going directly to our today's paper. So this research, which is still very much work in progress, is part of a larger project entitled Catholicizing Reproduction, Reproducing Catholicism, Activist Practices and Intimate Negotiations in Poland from 1930 to the present, which is led by Professor Agnieszka Kościańska at the University of Warsaw and funded by the National Science Foundation. So I cannot see the presentation. Do you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I can see my presentation.
We cannot see it. We cannot see it.
So I will try it once more, right? Okay. Can you see it now?
No, still not.
All right, let me.
If you want, I can give it a try, because
okay, so if you can give it a try, I think this would be easier.
I have, well, let's see.
Okay.
Just a second. Where is this? Share screen. But you can.
Okay, I stopped. Yeah.
Stop, and then I will try. Where is it? Yes, it's here. And now?
Still not.
So
okay,
yes,
it's
there it is. Yes, I see it.
Great. So just my computer is very slow. It's like every day slower and slower, but I hope I can just run it. Okay, that should be fine right now. Okay. So in this paper, we discuss Catholic teachings on family planning between 1930, when the encyclical Castigo Nubi was published, and mid-1950s, when abortion was liberalized in Poland, and the state-endorsed family planning campaign began, provoking church's vehement reaction to the birth control idea and practices. And now I cannot turn the slide. This is something. Okay.
But it's changing slowly.
Right.
So
yeah. I mean,
you need to take time.
I think it's my computer's kind of slow. Now, okay. So the 1930 encyclical explicitly forbade the use of so-called artificial contraception by Catholics and condemned abortion and divorce. In fact, however, it was rather the secular discussion around family planning and the activity of Tadeusz Bojżaleński in the early 30s that engendered Catholic reaction in Poland, rather than the publication of the encyclical. Therefore, the period under study embraces 25 years between two of the most crucial public debates on family planning in Polish history. Although it includes three politically and socially very different periods of the interwar period, war and occupation, and the 10 first years of the communist rule, we argue that the years 1930 to 1956 were coherent in terms of both methods and of transmitting Catholic teaching and its content. The only sub-periods that might be distinguished are the war and occupation period, where almost no publications were issued, and Stalinism from 1950 to 1955, when due to repression and limitations imposed by the state, the publishing activity of the church drastically diminished. The church's defensive position during these years affected the possibilities of transmission, publication of books and press titles, but not the content of the teachings. So we focus on publications on marriage and family planning issued with the official acceptance of the Catholic Church and published with the intention to discuss the family planning from Catholic positions. Those were mostly advice books directed to either married couples or fiancés in the process of preparation for marriage. All of them, with just one exception, that was Maria Kępińska, were written by men, priests and Catholic thinkers, and they tended to be issued by Catholic publishing houses. The list includes works by Polish authors, but also numerous translations, mostly from German. And these publications were diverse in terms of scope, as some of them focused on the theological dimension of marriage, while others concentrated on how to apply the Ogniow's method. Many of them contained tables for calculations of fertile and infertile periods and other practical information that was to enable Catholic couples to use the calendar method without instruction of medical professionals. Interestingly, Polish publications did not refer to natural family planning method that relied on measuring the temperature to establish fertile and infertile periods that was established in the mid-30s and used, for instance, in Silesia. A large number of the 1930s publications was reprinted several times during the pre-war decade and then republished in the post-1945 period. So we observe a strong continuity in terms of published titles and authors. And a short note about the language used in these publications. So during the 30s, as well as in the post-1945 period, Catholic authors tended to refer to the topic of the inquiry as periodical abstinence or natural regulation of birth. And they avoided the terms adopted by the birth control movement in Poland and abroad, such as birth control or conscious motherhood. Although in some instances, Catholic authors attempted to redefine the latter term, conscious motherhood, and to discuss and present it along the Catholic lines. Exploring main publications of the period, we focus on four themes. First, we ask what was the ideal family size promoted by Catholic writers, and what were the arguments behind it. Secondly, we examine how objectives of marriage were framed in the context of procreation. In the third place, we analyze the framing of the so-called calendar method in terms of goals and usage. And finally, we pay particular attention to the conceptualization of gender roles in the discourse around marriage, sexuality, and family planning. So first of the topics, family size. The ideal family size promoted by Catholic advice books throughout the period was a family with 4 or 5 children. Walenty Majdański called it conscious large family, an attitude between uncontrolled procreation and a small family with 1 or 2 or 3 children. Irrational procreation was deemed as unhealthy and damaging for marital relationship, as a priest Zygmunt Baranowski, author of 3 books on marriage in the late 40s, put it, I quote, "One shouldn't beget children without thinking," end of quotation. A marriage that is in harmony with nature, that's another quotation, should take health issues into account and regulate births. And rationality in procreation involved also an ability and moral strength to self-control. This, according, for example, to Majdański, was also a proof of high culture. Since limiting births required self-restraint, taking procreation under control helped to achieve higher moral standards. In the 1930s, Alexander Zajdlich, in his frequently reprinted Discovery of Dr. Ogino, stressed that blind and mechanical fertility should be replaced with the conscious one that would allow Catholics to fulfill their duty to God and the nation. Authors presented a range of arguments in favor of having more than one or two children. Stanisław Bross, author of Law of Marriage and the Family pamphlet published in 1935 and again in 1948, argued that mothers have enough love for many children, and then having many of them is a duty to the state and humanity. On the one hand, a big family fulfilled the law of nature that in Catholic writings was identified with laws of God. On the other, it fulfilled a social duty. In the pre-war years, which is interesting, the Catholic proponents of families with 4 or 5 children rarely and rather indirectly tackled population issues. Living in a country that was in the 1930s still characterized by high birth rates, one author perceived periodical abstinence as a way to prevent overpopulation in Poland. On the contrary, for Zajdlich, for instance, families with fewer than 5 children would mean the drop in the Polish population. The concern with population issues understandably increased in the post-war years, when, for instance, Jan Marski, in the 6th edition of his Marriage Faithful to Nature, argued that rational birth control would, quote, I quote, help rebuild the country devastated by war. And several other post-1945 publications stressed the demographic problems that Poland faced. And a certain exception against this background was Walenty Majdański, whose focus was on population. It was a strong focus in his publications. At the same time, population concern did not constitute the main argument for large-sized families presented in Catholic publications. Authors linked limiting the number of children to the health of mothers and children. For example, a German author translated to many languages, by the way, Ivan Georg, argued that too frequent births can harm a woman's health. And in a script for marriage preparation from the early 50s, an anonymous author advised not to give birth more frequently than every other year. According to Georg again, 4 to 5 children make it possible to have a normal and healthy family, and at the same time guarantee constant population growth. So in the discourse of around ideal family size, rationality, cultural behavior, normalcy, morality, and health were the key arguments in favor of regulating birth. And the second theme was discussed by us is primary and secondary aims of marriage. Catholic authors also discussed at length the topic of the objectives of marriage, debated in the context of the Church's teachings on procreation, sexuality, and family formation. Although Catholic priests and thinkers emphasized that the primary aim of marriage is reproduction, they acknowledged also marriage's secondary objectives, such as forming of the marital bond, uniting the couple, or providing mutual assistance. Secondary objectives of marriage, the authors insisted, constitute the reasons why Catholic couples might use church-approved fertility regulation. Several pre-war booklets recognize the importance of the sexual acts for the formation of the unity of the husband and wife. The German author Georg stressed that during sex, the couple constitutes one body, the experience pertinent for the husband and wife marital bond. The authors agreed that complete abstinence or celibacy should be the choice of priests, not of Catholic couples. Zeidlich, underscoring that marital sex is for Catholics the only possibility to satisfy sexual desire, put a lot of emphasis on other objectives of marriage, such as providing mutual aid or comfort and consolation. These aims were also emphasized in other interwar publications, as well as persisted in the post-war, in Catholic teachings in the post-war period. I quote, "A marital act is an expression of and bond of love," argued an American author, John O'Brien, whose book was translated and published in Poland in 1949. And the logical consequence of this was that permanent abstinence was harmful for marriage, as it could bring negative psychological consequences. Other authors also repeated a very popular argument that the sperm was beneficial for the female body, again linking theological arguments with medical ones. And I end here and hand over to Sylwia and move the slide.
All right, thank you so much, Natalia. So I will present on two themes, the calendar method and the gender roles. So first and foremost, so-called calendar method, or the Oginok-Knaus method of establishing fertile and infertile periods, was the sole method of natural regulation of births presented in Polish Catholic publications during the analyzed period. In the 1930s, the method was at large presented as an easy one and not requiring medical advice. Apart from easiness, Oginok-Knaus method was to be characterized by its reliability, the factor intrinsically linked to its scientific nature. The depiction of the method as the accomplishment of science figured firmly in the Catholic pre-war publications and was to stress the rationality of the whole Catholic system of fertility regulation. In pre-war publications, one may also find the rationale for the usage of Oginok-Knaus method by the Catholic couples. The need to regulate fertility was explained by such reasons as the health of the mother, whose well-being might be endangered by too frequent pregnancies, or by the economic arguments, convincing particularly during the years of the Great Depression, when the publications were issued. As one of the authors argued in 1937, and here I quote, "Today's economic system does not allow for feeding numerous offspring." Another characteristic 1930s argument might be framed as mild eugenic. Although some Catholic authors criticized hardline eugenic ideas as sterilization, they still perceived Catholic fertility regulation as a chance to produce high-quality children because of the possibility to choose the moment of conception or by the opportunity to prepare for the siring of the next child. The Oginok-Naus method was discussed as a healthy and moral alternative to any contraceptives, coitus interruptus, or abortion. Marital couples could enjoy sex and therefore cultivate secondary aims of marriage, yet without using immoral methods that would bring damaging effects on health. At the same time, natural family planning involved periodical abstinence, which, as already mentioned, helped to strengthen moral qualities of individuals. Oginok-Naus method meant using nature instead of abusing it and benefiting from natural infertility periods generously given to humans by God, as it was framed in our publications. Now, Natalia, could you please pass on the slide? Right, so now I would like to discuss briefly gender roles and like this conceptualization of gender that we have discovered in our publications.
The presentation.
Okay, all right. So
I will.
Okay, so no problem at all. All right, thank you. So the discussion on sexuality and family planning in Catholic publications revealed authors' ideas about gender. Women were seen as loving mothers by nature, ready to sacrifice for their offspring, also the unborn ones, when needed. However, women were also sexual beings, who should also enjoy marital sexual relations, with the exception of one author who saw, okay, great, thank you, Natalia, who saw sexual duty of wives as a burden for them. Most of the teachings stressed the need for pleasurable sex by both men and women. Both spouses have equal right to sexual intercourse, argued Sopoćko. Georg argued that pleasure was important for both sides and that the role of man was to assure pleasurable sex for the wife. Materials for premarital course in the early 1950s extensively explained that men should not behave violently and needed to be tender and caressing. Otherwise, sexual acts can provoke disgust and fear in women. And this was a brief quotation. Catholic authors also rejected the double standard in relation to premarital sexuality, requiring chastity from both men and women. Advice books promoted a model of Catholic manhood based on self-restraint, strong will, and care of women. These qualities were needed in order to practice natural birth control. Apparently, women did not need to develop similar qualities since their sexual appetite was regarded as smaller. This conviction was present in Catholic family planning literature since the 1930s, when one publication asserted that women agree more willingly to periodical abstinence. Men, because of their allegedly stronger sexual drive, were to prefer abortion or artificial contraception of methods of fertility regulation, as they did not require periodical abstaining from sex. And as I have very little time left, so let me proceed to the conclusions. So what we have argued is that there existed a visible continuity and coherence in Catholic discussions on family planning in the pre-1945 and post-1945 years, despite political and social differences that characterized these two periods that are usually separately discussed in Polish historiography. In Catholic families, births were to be regulated with the use of Oginok-Naus method that could help attaining the ideal family size, of one with 4 to 5 children. Catholic publications also promoted the fertility regulation as a method that was to enable Catholic marriages to meet the secondary objectives of marriage, such as satisfaction of sexual desire or mutual help or consolation. And natural regulation of births was presented as a rational choice and a scientific accomplishment, and as an easy and reliable method that could produce quality children. And to finish, we might also trace certain ideals regarding gender roles in our publications that stressed that women should be self-sacrificing mothers, whereas men should aspire to this ideal of self-restrained person. And importantly, the publications emphasized also the right to sexual pleasure for both men and women, although framing feminine and masculine sexuality in quite different terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalia Jarska and Dr. Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska for this very interesting presentation. We are leaving time for the last 20 minutes or so of our panel for the discussion, and now we are moving to the second paper of this session. It will be delivered by Dr. Denisa Nešťáková, who is a research associate at the Herder-Institut in Marburg within the project Family Planning in East Central Europe from the 19th century until the authorization of the pill. Dr. Nešťáková studied history and Slavic literature and language at the Comenius University in Bratislava and Jewish civilization at the Center for Jewish Studies in Heidelberg. And today at our conference, she is presenting her paper entitled A Slovak Woman, the Mother of Slovak Nation, ? So Dr. Denisa Nešťáková, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share my presentation and please do confirm if you can see it or if you can't.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So I will first of all say thank you very much for the invitation, and I can be part of this conference, which is a great conference in my point of view. And to keep my schedule and the time, I will start immediately with my presentation. So similarly as in today's Slovakia, where one would assume that dealing with a critical situation caused by COVID-19, there will be not enough time to deal with anything else, and politicians would be busy enough. It was similar in a wartime Slovak state, which was a Nazi satellite or a client state, where they also decided to shift their attention to something else and decided to address the family policies, restrict the reproduction rights, and redefine a woman's role in society. It was seemingly most unfavorable time, but over the time, and you will see from my presentation, it seems like that on the other hand, it was actually a very favorable time to do such a restrictions. So not despite, but perhaps because of the fact that the Slovakia was together with Nazi Germany in the war against Poland, or later against Soviet Union, and had to face related issues such as insufficient infrastructure of food delivery, or raising confusion related to anti-Semitic policies, the Slovak state urged the changes in family policies, accompanied with the vision of revival of so-called traditional values, the image of and changing the image of the Slovak woman or Slovak mother, or the mother of the Slovak nation. This was all strongly emphasized. In my paper, I would like to introduce, let me switch the slide, which doesn't work. It does. In my paper, I would like to introduce the creation of the ideal of the new Slovak woman and the reality of the woman. I would also like to guide you through the conception of the new woman, the propaganda of the motherhood, and societal double standards of women responses to state family policies. So immediately after the creation of the Slovak state in 1939, which was a client or puppet state of Nazi Germany, the period of proclaimed moral decay of Czechoslovakia was replaced with an era which had been marked by numerous efforts to reclaim and strengthen control over women's reproduction and sexuality. The ruling Hlinka Slovak's People Party, fueled by the nationalist and Catholic pronatalist discourses, did not only encourage population growth, but also wished to restore a so-called traditional family values. While the government aimed to encourage the population increase by social benefits, it predominantly relied on a legal punishment or public shaming of women who had abortions. Abortion at the time seemed to be the most frequent source of birth control. Slovakia was indeed then under major influence of Nazi Germany in many aspects, including the family politics. And some Slovak political circles led toward limited redefinition of sexuality as seen in Nazi Germany. For instance, when the exhibition of Deutsche Plastik der Gegenwart, or contemporary German sculpture, when it arrived to Bratislava in 1942, it was the most reviewed and celebrated artistic events of the year. Yet neither the majority of the Slovak political elites nor the artists wanted to promote the sexual frivolity, which they would label the similar art if it was not a German art. One of the reviewers described the sculpture Zwei Menschen by Josef Torak, which is on the presentation on the left side, as following. Two bodies, male and female, hug each other. The creator of the sculpture does not emphasize the mere affection of a man and a woman, but more the affection of human to human, the purity of the relationship between two people. The interpretation of the artwork wanted to distance from the potential sexualization or erotica of the art as much as possible. While Slovakia also created an institution similar to League of German Girls or Bund Deutsche Mädel in Slovak called in Slovakia it was a Hlinka's use for or its girl section, or keep producing appealing or rather chic way of advertisement of cosmetics or fashion. Unlike Nazi Germany, Slovakia was different and could not accept all innovation of National Socialism. For instance, Dagmar Herzog suggests that the family politics and regime of Nazi Germany was not repressive for everyone. According to her, for heterosexuals, no disabled, or non-Jews, in other words, the majority of the population, Nazi policy and practices turn out not to be so sexually repressive. Herzog also points out that throughout the existence of Nazi Germany, the racial purity and national recovery depended on a premarital chastity, monogamous and procreative marriage, and wholesome family life. However, she also added that the overall goal of Nazi sexual politics was not necessarily to suppress sexuality. In Slovakia, the situation was different. Apart from a smaller, rather radical group of Slovak National Socialists, the overall goal of Slovak sexual politics was to protect the social and gender hierarchy. This was connected to its conservative and dogmatic Catholic orientation. And then, as Eva Škorvankova points out, its preferable leaning towards Italian fascism was caused by the fact that Italian fascism had more of the conservative and Catholic aspects. Thus, while there was a certain tension between the so-called Catholic conservative wing of the Hlinka Slovak People Party and the more revolutionary National Socialists within the party, the perception of a woman remained in a conservative, moralistic view of a Catholic purity. Any portrayal of modern woman or employed woman, female student, was rather replaced by the idyllic pictures of girls and women in traditional folklore costumes, as you can see on this slide. Then, from the promotion of the motherhood during the Slovak state, we can learn about the contemporary discussion about the position of women and their primary role as mothers. For instance, in May 1939, so only 2 months after the state was created, the newspaper Slovak stated, quote, "A nation lives and will live in mothers," which in practice meant that women were needed especially to give birth to loyal Slovaks. Family politics of a Slovak state was influenced then by several factors. As I said, obviously by the family policy in Nazi Germany, but also in fascist Italy, and the teaching of Catholic Church. An encyclical of Casti Conubia from 1930s by Pius XI described the abortion as an intentional murder of an innocent person, and at the same time rejected any indication for abortion. The Pope also opposed contraceptives, as did Slovakia. The law of protection of fetus was approved in March 1941, and it tightened abortion policies. The exception was a serious threat to women's life. The procedure could be performed only in an institution designed by the Ministry of Interior after confirmation of the threat of a woman's life by 2 official doctors. Previous penalties have been increased, although in many cases the authorities promoted the new law as an act of Christian morality. The main reason of passing of this law was an effort to increase the population and preserve the gender order. The ideal of Slovak woman was a mother with numerous children. However, the state did not introduce any significant systematic socio-economical reforms which might have helped families and mothers. Government policy and its propaganda tools have strongly opposed abortions, almost without concerning the health of the mother, the social status of the family or the pregnant woman, or regardless the condition in which the pregnancy took place. As in many moral-oriented regimes, Slovak political elites too demanded something else from the people, and something else was expected from them, or they expected from themselves. Among many examples, I would like to bring an example of Rudolf de Long, who is on the picture, who was a Franciscan monk, also poet, and a supporter of the regime, as you can see from the picture in the middle, which is a title page of his book of poems called Gardisti na stráž from 1939, which can be translated as a guardist to the guard. And then the Slovak greetings na stráž could be understood as a parallel to German Heil Hitler. Meanwhile, he also had sexual relationship with a woman who gave a birth to their daughter. This woman was also Jewish. So his story of a double standard is just one of the many. Among others were political elites who continued to have a bohemian life, which included extensive drinking and extramarital sex. This was even more strengthened by the newly gained power and feeling of having basically a limitless power over the country. Among them was also the Slovak president, the Catholic priest, who also had a relationship with a woman in the town where he used to work as a priest in Bánovce. And he carried this relationship also after the 1939 when he became president of the country. This was very much also seen and perceived by the Slovak women, men, and the families. And then, obviously, a criticism towards these policies came. One of such a critical representation is a letter which I took a picture of, and you can see it on the presentation. This letter was signed by a woman from Trnava, but was basically an anonymous letter dated on May 1941. It was addressed to the presidency of the Slovak parliament. The senders, the woman from Trnava, who criticized the Slovak parliament's decision to pass a law without concerning the situation of Slovak people. And then the result was that the Slovak, quote, grumble, blasphemed God, and even become non-Christian just because you passed the law on maternity protection, end of the quote. These were in a very critical position, especially when it came to the reason for the creation of the law. Quote, it is easy to shout for gentlemen in high seats, so the poverty can be hatched, and then it could protect their backs when something goes wrong, end of the quote. It was clear that these women understood that the Republic or the state did not have in mind the Christian values and interests, but rather thought a multiplying of the nation or the population for their own interest. Additionally, the senders of the letters emphasized the dual morality of the government circles, not only in the context of their material well-being, extramarital affairs, but especially in the case of abortions. Quote, they can get help from the pregnancy because they have colleagues and they will, of course, arrange it for them. End of the quote. Indeed, the moralistic arguments of Hlinka's Slovak People Party and the introduction of the new law of protection of fetus in 1941 encountered several pitfalls. While no political mobilization or major protest actions against ban on abortions and contraception could have been made in a fascist-like Slovak state, there was an opposition. As the law targeted predominantly women became to oppose this law. Their main silent opposition was continuation or recreation of a network of clandestine abortionists. These were basically including gynecologists, but mostly midwives and so-called well-versed women as providers of abortion. The transmitters, these were usually women and men who had the knowledge who would be the provider, and then the woman who sought to undergo the procedure of the abortion. Such opposition or alternative family planning was the only option for Slovak women to protest against regulation of their sexuality and control of their bodies. I suggest that the response of the Slovak woman to ban of contraception and abortion was not to complying with the law, but rather developing own strategies to control of fertility. This means bypassing the law by pursuing clandestine abortions. Thus, even the criminal persecution, which was supposed to restore the societal hierarchy, did not prevent Slovak women's claims to autonomy concerning their own bodies. The fact that the woman responded by continuing to have abortion despite or in opposition to the patriotic demand of the newly established state suggests that the clandestine abortion can be considered to be a form of protest. Then, similarly to Joanna Meštal's finding, I too consider the privatization of the abortion care the widespread, but in this case loosely organized clandestine form of protest. To conclude, the redefining of the family politics and the role of women in Slovak state was a result of the newly established state and its need to determine itself in contrast to previous regime of Czechoslovakia, which was then perceived as an immoral decay. It was also a result of a continuation of the struggle and some sort of a moral duty of some conservative politicians who were against any liberalism already in the Czechoslovak parliament. However, for many politicians, it was an opportunity to distract the attention from other more crucial problems, as we can see it today in Slovakia with a poorly managed situation caused by COVID-19. In case of the Slovak state, to distract for wartime economics, lacking crops, duty to enlist men, decreasing support for war, or nepotism connected to so-called Aryanization, the process of basically stealing Jewish properties and businesses in order to give them into Slovak hands. Last but not least, it was also a great chance to prevent any changes in a gender hierarchy. Certainly, there was a conflicting portrayal of a woman throughout the existence of a Slovak state, the idyllic, almost pastoral woman on the one hand, and the young, engaged members of the Hlinka's youth, or a chic, slinky-looking city woman on the other hand. But all of them would be only appreciated as the mothers and educators of future Slovak generations. Instead of the increasing birthday, the wartime Slovakia policies ultimately harmed the society and women in particular, while at the same time fueled the contra actions. Similarly, similar family policies have continued to carry the legacy of this time until the present days, and not only in Slovakia, obviously, where the populist and undemocratic forces against gender equality and women's reproductive rights see such family policies as an ethical model to be achieved, On the other hand, women, activists, and democratic society see these acts leading towards a similar restriction of family policies as an attack on a woman's rights to agency over her own body, and thus as an attack of human rights and democratic values. Any limitation of reproductive rights is therefore seen as a warning and an impulse to act in today's Slovakia, for example, where during the whole pandemic, the government kept reintroducing new proposals to restrict access to abortion almost every 6 months. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denisa Nešťáková, for this presentation and for time discipline. We are now shifting to the Q&A section of this panel, and we do have some questions already to all of our speakers. So the first one is from Professor Fritz to Sylvia and Natalia, and it says, as Pope Pius recommended the calendar method only in 1951, and Ogino published his research in Japanese language only in 1927, and Knaus in German in 1928. What has been the official Catholic recommendation in the 1930s?
Right, I will be happy to take this question. Thank you so much. It's really interesting and important. So let me start by saying that as far as we know, there was no official Catholic recommendation in the 1930s. And let me develop this in a moment. But what we have noticed that Polish authors, they relied mostly on the publication of Jan Nicolaus Smulders, who was a Dutch physician who as if popularized the Ogino-Knaus method in the Netherlands, but somehow also in Poland, right? As he came up with this calendar method tables and kind of helped to adopt this as a fertility regulation method in the 1930s, right? So the Polish authors, they did not rely so much on Ogino and Knaus publications, but they rather referred to Smulders who made the method more accessible as far as we know. So this is the question, this is the answer to the first part of the question, but regarding this official kind of recommendation, so what we have noticed is that there was a debate in the Catholic Church in Poland regarding the calendar method, and they were people who were named by Zajdlich as conservative theologists and some liberal theologists. So there was an opposition to make the method widely known to the public, probably because of this population concern that the Polish couples would practice, the Catholic couples would practice fertility regulation, and this would lead to the population drop. But all the publications that we have used, they got something called imprimatur from the church, right? So this official seal of approval, and they put it on the title page, so every Catholic believer could make sure that what he or she does is church approved methods. And I think that it was also a kind of conclusion made by the authors of our publications that if the Pope condemned artificial methods, then what was framed as natural method was okay, right? So that they made such conclusion, but as you correctly stressed, this official approval, official recommendation, this is a post-war thing. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have more questions coming to all of our participants. So another one to Natalia and Sylwia from Katarzyna Liszkova, who participated yesterday at our conference, who delivered a paper. And the question is, were there traces of sexual enjoyment in marriage or was the Polish Catholic discourse focused on reproductive aspects of sex only?
Shall I take this one? Yeah, as we already mentioned, this was for at least some authors, it was very important to stress female sexual pleasure also. I mean that there's a certain kind of equality between spouses in this regard. So yeah, and effectively, yes, marriage serves also to like satisfy sexual needs of the spouses, not, and the sex doesn't serve only to for the reproduction. Okay, so yes, definitely, but not in all of these books, I would say, because there was a variety of approaches to sexuality. Because in some books you would find more, some authors elaborated more on that, and while the others were just more focused on procreation. Sylwia, would you like to add something to this?
Well, so I agree, right? So that there was quite a strong emphasis, particularly in the post-war period, right? That this like secondary objectives of marriage, right? So like the satisfaction of the sexual needs, of the sexual drive. So it was to be fulfilled with this usage of the method. Thank you.
Thank you. To Denisa from Joanna Nieznanowska. To what extent the Slovak clandestine abortion underground you have described was a pro bono enterprise, and to what extent it was a black market phenomenon based on demand delivery grounds?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. It was a combination of both. So obviously there were a lot of people who were basically economically exploiting those women who were searching for abortions. And there were also those who were actually, and this was mostly either the midwives or the so-called well-versed women who would do it for something like a dozen of eggs, or because of a sympathy. So there were women who would say that I did it because for free, because I kind of am compassionate with the poor woman and so on. This obviously could have been also an argument to protect themselves when they were persecuted, because if they would not say that it was paid for, that means that potentially the punishment could have been a little bit lower. What is, however, the more interesting part is how these different levels cooperated together to kind of cover for each other. So usually neither the doctors nor the woman would be telling on the other side of the equation, but they would be rather trying to protect both themselves, but also the woman whom abortion had. So that's the reason why, considering the not necessarily just a black market, but also some sort of a alternative way of having a family policies. Not necessarily the legal one, but obviously the clandestine one.
Thank you. Another question to you from Vipka Lizna. To what extent Knaus Ogino, as church-supported contraceptive method, became social practice in Poland before, during, and after the war? How did the women learn about the Knaus Ogino method? So the question is about Poland. Oh, sorry, this one is to Sylwia and Natalia. I'm very sorry about that.
That's fine, and thank you so much for this question. A really kind of demanding question, right? Because we don't know, to be honest. And the sources that we have analyzed, they do not reflect on this. And I'm afraid that particularly for the pre-war and war periods, this will be very difficult to establish how popular the methods were. So what we can say that one of the ways to popularize the method, to make it known by women, were the publications that we have analyzed. Like several of them were issued in like 5 or even more editions, right? And their circulation was quite high. So the idea was that women would learn about the method by reading these publications. Like the research by Katarzyna Jarkiewicz on the post-war period also shows that there were certain advice centers that were run by the Catholic Church that instructed about the method, but we haven't stressed this yet, and we haven't encountered like many sources that discuss it. So there were certainly the ways how women could learn about this, but like systematic teaching of the Catholic Church, it started after 1956, and the abortion legislation that mobilized the Catholic Church in Poland, and when the lay instructors, women instructors, as well as the clergy, when they began to offer like instruction in church, in parishes. So this is certainly the post-1956 phenomenon, this like wide popularization of the method.
Thank you. This question from Vikalisna is to Denisa. Did you find ego document concerning motives of women to have an abortion and midwives to perform them?
Thank you very much for the question. If I may, just about the method. So in the case of Czechoslovakia, during the interwar period, it's interesting that apparently there were some sort of flyers which women and potentially men could pick up at the church. So I haven't found such a flyer, but this is what I know from like a secondary literature when they are talking about it, that there were certain flyers. So I would assume that potentially something similar could have been in Poland as well in the interwar period. Mm-hmm. Towards the question, yeah, I found the ego documents, but these are ego documents. This is basically a police investigation or the court files where the women are basically asked for motivation or etc. So mostly the cases which are still in the archives are the cases from women from lower classes, because usually women from higher classes would have abortion provided by a gynecologist, which usually meant that it was rather safe abortion and they would never been discovered that they ever had abortions. So the women I had researched would be those women who ended with a clinic or somehow got betrayed by somebody and were told by police they had abortion. So usually it was so during the wartime period, either the man was already listed, so he was fighting somewhere in an Eastern Front, and they became pregnant just shortly before, and they were alone with already, let's say, 2-3 kids, and they didn't have financially resources to provide for the family. Or these were single women whose life basically depended on their occupation, and usually this was either maids or workers in the factories. And if they would be discovered as being pregnant, they will be automatically kicked out from their occupations. And that usually meant not only losing job for themselves, meaning losing possibility to survive economically, but very often they were also supporting their families. So parents, usually if the parents had many kids and they didn't have jobs, so these girls, basically single young women, would lose the opportunity to support their families as well. So usually it was an economical reason why women decided for abortion.
Okay, thank you. And the last two questions. The first one is to Denisa. Can you elaborate on Czechoslovakia being perceived as immoral by some present-day discourses? Who are the proponents of these discourses and how do they construct their claims? And this question comes from Ms. Katarzyna Liszkova.
Thank you very much. Czechoslovakia by Slovak state was considered to be some sort of very liberal Czecho-Jewish creation instead of being a national Slovak representative. So it had to redefine itself in a contrast to the previous regime. So they were picturing Czechoslovakia as some sort of morally loosened or too urban space. So and on a contrast, Slovakia is supposed to be something more village-like, something more nature, connected to nature and so on. So very different from Czechoslovakia, which is sort of funny because Czechoslovak regime never approved abortions. It was still throughout the whole existence of Czechoslovakia, the ban on abortion existed and so on. So there were not that much of the changes. Nevertheless, the Slovak regime wanted to picture itself as a morally more stronger, and especially more standing more for Catholic Church in comparison to the Czechoslovak regime. Thanks.
Thank you. And the last question to Sylwia and Natalia from Elżbieta Kasner. Were there differences in the reception of birth control ideas of the church among the urban and the village population? In which circles and in which forums were these discussed? While women's voices are visible in sources such as women's magazines on the topic of family planning, are there any also forums where men also talked about family planning? So we have 3 questions in one.
Okay, shall I start? Maybe Sylvia, and hand over to you. Yeah, I mean, same as for the previous question, I would say that we don't have such detailed knowledge on this period, but what I would stress is that in the later years, like in the 60s and 70s, we have a lot of more sources, and then we can learn. For example, I would stress the importance of personal narratives, such as memoirs or interviews. And then, at least for the later period, I suppose that it should have been the same in the 30s and 40s. And early 50s, we can see that there is a huge difference between urban and rural population in general in their approach, not only to Catholic and non-Catholic approaches and ideas about birth control, but to the limitation, to the idea of limiting births at all. I mean, in Poland, in the 60s, and then you can see it also in some statistical or public opinion surveys that begin in the late 60s, that there was a difference in approach to birth control between urban and rural population. So yeah, and women's voices and men's voices. Again, I have studied a lot of, not for this research, but the previous one, a lot of personal narratives, and men are also there, and yeah, share their opinions. Maybe it's even surprising that to that extent they are also concerned with it, or maybe not, I don't know. Yeah, but I will also give a chance to Sylvia to answer this question.
Oh, all right. So thank you. I think that we are wrapping this up, right?
Yes,
so
we are.
my answer will be very, very short. So what I would like to stress is that the publications, like the Catholic family planning publications, that they framed the teaching of the method as a marriage kind of affair, right? So that these were publications intended for marriages, that the word marital, it is very much present in the titles. And somehow the assumption was that the fertility regulation, that the natural family planning is a marital affair, that it is a man and a woman who are supposed to be involved. And it was then stressed in the following decades, so in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it is also visible for the period that we analyze. Right, so thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Good, so our session has come to an end, and I would like to thank all our participants for their papers, Dr. Natalia Jarska, Dr. Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, and Dr. Denisa Nešťáková. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone who's watching and listening. Thank you for very interesting questions. We are now breaking for 55 minutes, and we will be back at 1:30 p.m. for the next session, Abortion Cultures. So join us then. And for now, from me and the rest of the team, it's see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.